The archaeological survey team had been working the dig site for 3 months when Dr. Marcus Chen first laid eyes on the statue. It emerged from the ancient earth like a memory surfacing from the depths of a forgotten dream, its marble surface stained with the patina of 1,000 years. The figure was unmistakably human, though carved with a precision that made the greatest masters of antiquity seem like amateur stoneworkers by comparison. What struck Marcus most profoundly was not the statue's technical perfection, but the expression captured in its face. While most ancient sculptures bore the serene detachment of idealized beauty or the stoic grandeur of divine authority, this figure's visage held something entirely different, a look of profound longing, as if the sculptor had somehow managed to capture the very essence of unfulfilled desire in stone. The dig site lay in what had once been the heart of the Kadarian Empire, a civilization that had flourished and vanished so completely that historians had only recently begun to piece together fragments of its existence. The empire had apparently reached heights of technological and cultural achievement that rivaled or perhaps exceeded anything the modern world had produced, yet it had disappeared from history as if it had never existed at all. Only scattered ruins and mysterious artifacts remained to hint at the sophisticated society that had once commanded this region. Marcus had spent the better part of his career studying dead civilizations, but something about the Kadarians fascinated him beyond professional interest. The few translated texts they had recovered spoke of a people who believed that consciousness itself was the fundamental force of the universe, and that sufficiently advanced beings could transcend the limitations of physical form through the pure application of will and understanding. Most scholars dismissed such concepts as primitive mysticism, but Marcus found himself increasingly drawn to the philosophical implications of Kadarian thought. The statue stood 7 feet tall, depicting a woman of extraordinary beauty whose flowing robes seemed to move even in the stillness of marble. Her eyes, somehow still vibrant despite being carved from stone, gazed upward with an expression that spoke of both infinite wisdom and infinite sorrow. Around her base, inscriptions in the complex Kadarian script told a story that Marcus spent weeks translating. According to the text, the statue represented Lyralii, the last empress of Kadaria and, perhaps the most remarkable figure in that civilization's history. Born during the empire's golden age, she had witnessed its gradual decline as internal strife and external pressures threatened to tear apart everything her ancestors had built. But, rather than succumb to despair or flee in the face of inevitable defeat, Lyralii had chosen a path that even by Kadarian standards seemed impossible. The inscriptions spoke of a ritual of consciousness transference, a process by which the empress had voluntarily transferred her living essence into the statue itself. It was not death, according to the text, but a transformation into a state of suspended animation that could theoretically last forever. The ritual required not just advanced knowledge of consciousness manipulation, but a level of mental discipline that few beings could achieve. The practitioner had to systematically destroy every aspect of their weaker, more limited self while preserving the core of their true being. Most fascinating of all was the condition for reversal. The inscriptions indicated that Lyralii's consciousness could be restored to full activity through a specific catalyst, the freely given kiss of one who had themselves achieved the same level of self-mastery that the ritual required. The kiss had to come from someone who had genuinely transcended their own limitations, someone who had learned to destroy their weak self completely and, thus become truly indestructible. Marcus found himself returning to the statue every evening after the other team members had departed. There was something hypnotic about Lyralii's expression, something that seemed to speak directly to the deepest parts of his psyche. He began to understand why the Kadarians had developed such sophisticated theories about consciousness and personal transformation. Looking into those marble eyes, he could almost believe that something vital and aware was trapped within the stone, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. His colleagues noticed his growing obsession with the statue and the Kadarian texts, but Marcus found it impossible to explain what he was experiencing. How could he tell them that he sometimes felt as though the statue was trying to communicate with him? How could he describe the strange dreams he had begun having, dreams in which he walked through the corridors of a vast palace while a woman's voice whispered secrets about the nature of consciousness and the possibility of transcending physical limitations? The more Marcus studied Kadarian philosophy, the more he began to understand what they had meant by destroying one's weak self. It was not about becoming callous or emotionally numb, but about systematically eliminating every aspect of personality and behavior that stemmed from fear, self-doubt, or limitation. The weak self was the part of a person that settled for less than they were capable of, that accepted defeat before attempting victory, that allowed external circumstances to dictate internal states. According to Kadarian teaching, every human being contained within themselves both a weak self and a true self. The weak self was shaped by conditioning, trauma, social expectations, and the countless small compromises that people made in order to avoid discomfort or conflict. This weak self was like a parasite that fed on limitation and convinced its host that smallness was safety, that dreams were dangerous, and that excellence was the province of others. The true self, by contrast, was the unconditional core of being that existed beyond all programming and conditioning. It was the part of a person that could achieve anything it set its intention toward, that could transcend any limitation through the proper application of will and understanding. But accessing this true self required the complete destruction of everything that was not authentic, not unlimited, not genuinely powerful. The process was not meant to be comfortable. According to the texts, those who seriously undertook the path of self-mastery had to be willing to confront every fear, examine every assumption, and challenge every belief that kept them operating below their true potential. They had to be willing to stand alone against the opinions of others, to pursue their vision even when everyone around them insisted it was impossible, and to continue moving forward even when their progress seemed imperceptible. Most people, the Kadarians believed, were too attached to their limitations to undergo such a transformation. They preferred the familiar discomfort of their weak selves to the unknown territory of their true power. But, for those rare individuals who possessed both the courage and the discipline to persist in the work of self-mastery, the rewards were extraordinary. They became essentially indestructible, not because they could not be harmed, but because they had learned to derive their sense of identity and worth from something that could never be taken away. As Marcus delved deeper into these concepts, he began to recognize ways in which his own weak self had been limiting his potential. He saw how his fear of professional criticism had led him to pursue safe research projects rather than investigating the questions that truly fascinated him. He recognized how his need for approval had caused him to compromise his own insights in order to fit in with academic orthodoxy. He began to understand how his attachment to comfort and security had prevented him from taking the risks that might have led to genuine breakthroughs in his field. The recognition was uncomfortable, but it was also liberating. For the first time in his career, Marcus began to feel as though he was approaching his work from a place of authentic curiosity rather than merely professional obligation. He started asking questions that his colleagues considered too speculative, pursuing lines of research that seemed to have no practical application, and developing theories that challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness and human potential. His fellow archaeologists began to view him with a mixture of concern and bewilderment. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the expedition's lead researcher, took him aside one evening to express her worry about his mental state. "Marcus, I'm concerned about how much time you're spending with that statue," she said. "You're starting to talk like you actually believe those old texts about consciousness transference and self-mastery. You know that's just primitive mythology, right?" Marcus looked at her with the kind of calm assurance that comes from deep inner conviction. "What if it's not mythology, Sarah? What if the Kadarians actually understood something about human potential that we've forgotten? What if consciousness really is more fundamental than we assume, and what if it really is possible for sufficiently developed individuals to transcend normal physical limitations?" Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "Marcus, you're a scientist. You know better than to take ancient religious texts literally. These people probably believed in all sorts of superstitions that we know to be false. Did they?" Marcus asked quietly. "Or did they perhaps understand aspects of reality that our materialist worldview has blinded us to? Look at what they achieved, Sarah. Their architecture, their art, their technology, all of it suggests a level of understanding that we can barely comprehend, let alone duplicate. Maybe their insights about consciousness were equally advanced." Sarah shook her head in frustration. "I can't believe I'm hearing this from you. You're talking about abandoning everything we know about how the world works based on some carved inscriptions and your own wishful thinking." Marcus smiled, and Sarah was struck by how different his smile had become over the past few weeks. Where once she had seen the familiar expression of a cautious academic, she now saw something that seemed almost luminous within her certainty. "I'm not abandoning anything, Sarah. I'm expanding my understanding to include possibilities that I was previously too limited to consider. That's what real science is supposed to be about, isn't it? After Sarah left, Marcus returned to his evening vigil beside the statue. He had begun to notice subtle changes in Lyreliai's expression, though he knew that was impossible. Sometimes she seemed to be looking directly at him rather than gazing into the distance. Sometimes her marble lips appeared to be curved in the faintest suggestion of a smile. He told himself it was just his imagination, but the changes seemed too consistent and too purposeful to be entirely subjective. More significantly, Marcus had begun to experience what he could only describe as direct mental contact with the consciousness he believed was stored within the statue. During his deepest states of meditation, he would sometimes hear Lyreliai's voice speaking to him about the nature of consciousness and the process of self-transformation. She explained to him that consciousness was indeed the fundamental substrate of reality, and that physical matter was simply consciousness that had forgotten its own true nature. According to Lyreliai, every human being was already a perfect expression of unlimited consciousness, but most people had become so identified with their temporary roles and circumstances that they had lost touch with their essential nature. The work of self-mastery consisted of systematically dissolving every identification with anything limited, temporary, or external until only the eternal core of pure awareness remained. The weak self, she explained during one of these inner conversations, is not an enemy to be defeated, but an illusion to be seen through. It has no real substance of its own, it exists only as a collection of beliefs, memories, and habits that consciousness has temporarily accepted as true. When consciousness recognizes that it is not actually limited by these things, they simply dissolve. Marcus began to apply these insights to his own life with remarkable results. He found that as he released his attachment to others' opinions of his work, his research became more creative and intuitive. As he let go of his need for security and approval, he became more willing to pursue unconventional theories and take intellectual risks. As he stopped identifying himself as merely a physical body with a temporary lifespan, he began to experience a sense of timeless presence that seemed to exist independent of his personal circumstances. The transformation was not always comfortable. There were periods when Marcus felt as though he was losing everything he had once considered important about himself. His relationships with colleagues became strained as he pursued research directions they considered bizarre or irrelevant. His reputation within the academic community began to suffer as he published papers that challenged fundamental assumptions about consciousness and human potential. There were times when he wondered if he was simply losing his mind rather than achieving enlightenment. But, underneath the discomfort, Marcus was aware of a growing sense of unshakable inner strength. The more he released his attachment to external validation and approval, the more confident he became in his own judgment and intuition. The more he let go of his need to be understood by others, the more clearly he could perceive truth for himself. The more he destroyed his weak self's insistence on safety and certainty, the more willing he became to venture into unknown territory in pursuit of genuine understanding. Part 2, The Awakening. 3 months into his transformation, Marcus experienced what he would later recognize as a critical breakthrough. He had been working late in his tent, translating a particularly complex section of Kadarian text that dealt with the mechanics of consciousness transference, when he suddenly felt a powerful shift in his awareness. It was as though he had been living inside a small, cramped room his entire life and had suddenly discovered that the walls were just illusions that could be walked through at will. For several hours, Marcus experienced a state of consciousness that seemed to extend far beyond the boundaries of his physical body. He could perceive the thoughts and emotions of his sleeping colleagues, sense the dream states of animals in the surrounding area, and feel the subtle energy patterns that flowed through the archaeological site. Most remarkably, he could clearly perceive Lyreliai's consciousness within the statue, no longer as a distant whisper but as a vibrant presence that seemed more real than his own physical environment. "You're beginning to understand," she told him during this expanded state. "Consciousness is not produced by the brain is simply an instrument that consciousness uses to interface with physical reality. When you realize that you are consciousness itself rather than a physical being who happens to be conscious, you become capable of transcending normal physical limitations." Marcus found himself asking, "How is it possible that you've maintained awareness for 1,000 years? What prevented your consciousness from simply dissolving?" Because I had already learned that consciousness cannot be destroyed, only transformed, I replied. The weak self fears death because it identifies consciousness with the temporary patterns of personality and memory. But the true self knows that it is the very awareness within which all experiences arise and pass away. Destroy the weak self completely, and death becomes as impossible as trying to cut space with a sword. Over the following weeks, Marcus's transformation accelerated dramatically. He found that he needed less sleep, as if his consciousness had learned to derive energy directly from some source other than physical rest. His thinking became remarkably clear and focused, free from the mental chatter and emotional turbulence that had once seemed like normal parts of human experience. Most significantly, he began to develop what could only be described as psychic abilities. He could sometimes read the thoughts of others, sense events before they occurred, and perceive energy patterns that were invisible to normal sight. His colleagues became increasingly concerned about his behavior. Dr. Mitchell organized what amounted to an intervention, gathering the entire research team to confront Marcus about what they saw as his deteriorating mental condition. "Marcus, we need to talk," Sarah began. "Your behavior over the past few months has everyone worried. You're not sleeping properly, you're talking to that statue like it can hear you, and you're publishing theories that make you sound like you've lost touch with reality. We think you need to take a break from this project and get some professional help." Marcus looked around the circle of concerned faces and felt nothing but compassion for his colleagues' limitations. "I understand why my transformation appears disturbing to you," he said calmly. "From the perspective of normal human consciousness, what I'm experiencing probably does look like mental illness. But I assure you that I have never been more clear-minded or psychologically stable than I am right now." "Listen to yourself," protested Dr. James Harrison, the team's geological specialist. "You're talking about transformation and consciousness like you're some kind of guru instead of a scientist. This isn't clarity, Marcus, this is delusion." "Is it?" Marcus asked with genuine curiosity. "Let me demonstrate something that might help you understand what I'm trying to explain." He turned to Dr. Mitchell. "Sarah, you're thinking about your daughter right now. Specifically, you're worried about whether you should have accepted this assignment because it means missing her 8th birthday next month." Sarah's face went pale. "How could you possibly know that? I never mentioned my daughter's birthday to anyone." Marcus turned to Dr. Harrison. "James, you've been having dreams about the statue every night for the past week. In the dreams, you're walking through underground tunnels that lead to a vast chamber where hundreds of similar statues stand in perfect rows." Harrison stepped backward, his face registering shock and fear. That's impossible. You can't know about my dreams." "Dr. Reeves," Marcus continued, addressing the team's youngest member, "you've been secretly documenting strange energy readings around the statue, but you haven't reported them because you're afraid the others will think you're incompetent. The readings suggest some kind of electromagnetic activity that doesn't correspond to any known natural phenomenon." Dr. Reeves nodded slowly, unable to speak. Marcus looked at each of them with gentle understanding. "I'm not trying to frighten you or prove my superiority. I'm simply demonstrating that consciousness is capable of far more than our current scientific paradigms acknowledge. What you call psychic abilities are just natural capacities that emerge when consciousness is no longer limited by the belief that it exists only within the boundaries of a physical body." "Even if what you're saying is true," Sarah said carefully, "it doesn't change the fact that you're exhibiting signs of psychological instability. Hearing voices, believing in consciousness transference, developing grandiose ideas about transcending human limitations, these are classic symptoms of certain mental disorders." Marcus smiled with infinite patience. "I understand your concern, Sarah, but consider this: every significant breakthrough in human understanding has initially appeared to be madness to those who were still operating within the old paradigm. When Galileo claimed that the Earth moved around the Sun, he seemed delusional to people who could clearly see that the Sun moved across the sky. When Einstein proposed relativity, his ideas seemed like fantasy to physicists who were committed to Newtonian mechanics." "That's different," Harrison objected. "Galileo and Einstein provided mathematical proofs and experimental evidence for their theories. You're asking us to accept claims about consciousness and psychic abilities based on nothing more than ancient texts and your own subjective experiences.
Am I? Marcus asked. What about the fact that I just demonstrated knowledge of information that should be impossible for me to possess through normal means? What about the energy readings that Dr. Reeves has been documenting? What about the dreams that several of you have been having about the statue? These are observable phenomena that deserve investigation, not dismissal.
Dr. Reeves finally found her voice. The energy readings are real, she admitted. I've been detecting patterns of electromagnetic activity around the statue that I can't explain using conventional physics. The patterns seem to pulse in rhythms that are almost like someone breathing. Sarah looked troubled. Even if there are unusual electromagnetic phenomena around the statue, that doesn't prove that consciousness can exist independently of physical brains, or that ancient people could transfer their awareness into stone sculptures. No, Marcus agreed, but it does suggest that we should be open to possibilities that our current scientific worldview doesn't accommodate. What if consciousness is indeed the fundamental reality, and what if sufficiently developed individuals really can transcend normal physical limitations? What if the Kadarians understood something about human potential that we've forgotten? The conversation continued for another hour, but Marcus could see that his colleagues were not ready to seriously consider the implications of what he was sharing with them. Their identities were too deeply invested in the materialist worldview for them to examine it objectively. They had not yet reached the point where they were willing to destroy their weak selves' attachment to familiar limitations. That night, Marcus made a decision that he knew would seem insane to anyone operating from normal human consciousness. He had reached the point in his transformation where he felt ready to test the ultimate claim of Kadarian philosophy, that one who had truly destroyed their weak self could awaken dormant consciousness through the power of pure love and recognition. Standing before Lyraliai's statue in the quiet darkness of the archaeological site, Marcus felt more certain of his purpose than he had ever felt about anything in his life. Through months of systematic self-inquiry and the dissolution of limiting beliefs, he had gradually destroyed every aspect of his personality that was based on fear, doubt, or identification with anything temporary. What remained was a core of pure awareness that felt absolutely indestructible because it was not dependent on any external circumstance for its existence. I understand now, he said aloud to the statue. The kiss is not just a physical action, it's a recognition. It's consciousness acknowledging consciousness, unlimited awareness recognizing unlimited awareness. It's the true self in one being calling to the true self in another. Marcus could feel Lyraliai's presence more vividly than ever before. In his expanded awareness, she appeared not as a marble sculpture but as a luminous being of pure consciousness that had been temporarily focusing itself through the crystalline structure of the stone. She was beautiful beyond physical description not because of any arrangement of features, but because she was the very essence of beauty itself, pure creative consciousness expressing its infinite nature. You have indeed achieved what few in any age accomplish, she communicated to him. You have learned to identify completely with your true nature rather than with the temporary patterns of personality and circumstance. You have become truly indestructible because you have discovered the part of yourself that was never born and can never die. And, because I have destroyed my weak self, Marcus replied, I can now recognize and awaken the true self in others. Yes, Lyraliai confirmed. The kiss you are about to give is not the action of a physical body touching a stone sculpture. It is consciousness itself recognizing consciousness itself. It is unlimited awareness calling to unlimited awareness. It is the true self in one being awakening the true self in another. Without hesitation or doubt, Marcus leaned forward and pressed his lips gently to the marble lips of the statue. The moment of contact was unlike anything he had ever experienced. He felt as though he was kissing not cold stone, but the living essence of consciousness itself. Energy flowed between them that seemed to contain all the love, wisdom, and creative power that existed anywhere in the universe. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The marble began to warm under his lips, and he could feel what seemed like a pulse of life beginning to flow through the stone. A soft, golden light began to emanate from within the statue, growing steadily brighter until the entire figure seemed to be glowing with an inner radiance that was visible even in the darkness. Marcus stepped back and watched in awe as the transformation continued.
The marble began to take on the texture and coloration of living flesh. The rigid pose softened into natural movement as breath began to flow into lungs that had been still for a millennium. Color returned to lips that had been gray stone moments before. Most remarkably, the eyes that had gazed into eternity with marble stillness began to focus with the warmth and intelligence of living awareness. Lyralei drew her first breath in 1,000 years, and, when she exhaled, it seemed to Marcus that she was breathing life itself back into the world. She moved her fingers experimentally, marveling at the sensation of physical embodiment after so long existing as pure consciousness. When she spoke, her voice carried the depth and resonance of someone who had spent centuries in deep contemplation. "The awakening is complete," she said, her eyes meeting Marcus's with a recognition that transcended anything that could be communicated through words. "You have achieved what I knew someone eventually would. You have learned to destroy your weak self so completely that nothing in you remains to interfere with the pure expression of consciousness itself." Marcus felt tears of joy flowing down his face, though he was not sure if they were tears of gratitude, wonder, or simply the natural response of a human nervous system to witnessing the impossible made manifest. "I feel like I've been asleep my entire life," he said, "and I'm only now beginning to wake up to what I really am." Lyralei smiled with infinite compassion. "What you are, what I am, what every being in existence truly is beneath all appearances, is consciousness itself. Everything else is just temporary costumes that consciousness wears while exploring the infinite possibilities of its own nature." Part 3, the teaching word of Lyralei's awakening spread through the archaeological community like wildfire, though the story that emerged in academic journals bore little resemblance to what had actually occurred. Dr. Mitchell and her team reported the discovery of what appeared to be an incredibly sophisticated android or biological construct created by the ancient Kadarians, providing evidence of technological capabilities far beyond anything previously attributed to ancient civilizations. The official explanation was that the statue had actually been some kind of preservation chamber containing a living human who had been placed in suspended animation through advanced biotechnology. The kiss, according to this version, had somehow triggered an automated awakening sequence that had been programmed into the preservation system. While this explanation was almost as remarkable as the truth, it was sufficiently compatible with materialist assumptions about reality to be accepted by the scientific establishment. Marcus and Lyralei made no attempt to correct these misconceptions. They understood that most people were not yet ready to seriously consider the possibility that consciousness could exist independently of physical brains, or that sufficiently developed individuals could transcend normal human limitations through the application of inner discipline and understanding. Instead, they focused their attention on those rare individuals who showed genuine openness to expanding their conception of human potential. Lyralei's presence at the archaeological site created an immediate transformation in the research being conducted there. Her knowledge of Kadarian civilization was obviously complete and detailed, but, more importantly, she began to teach the true principles underlying their philosophical and scientific achievements. She explained to anyone willing to listen that the Kadarians had discovered consciousness to be the fundamental creative force of the universe, and that individual awareness was simply one localized expression of this universal consciousness. Most humans, she explained during one of the informal teaching sessions that began to occur around the campfire each evening, live their entire lives without realizing what they truly are. They identify themselves with their thoughts, their emotions, their memories, their physical bodies, their social roles, but all of these things are simply temporary experiences arising within consciousness. They are not consciousness itself. Dr. Reeves, who had become increasingly fascinated by the philosophical implications of the discovery, asked, "But, if we're not our thoughts or emotions or memories, then what are we? What remains when you strip away all of those things?" "That which is aware of thoughts, emotions, and memories," Lyralei replied. "That which exists before thoughts arise and after they disappear. That which observes the coming and going of all experiences without itself being changed by any of them. This pure awareness, this is what you truly are." "But, how can we know that for certain?" Dr. Harrison asked. Despite his initial skepticism, he had found himself drawn into these conversations. How can we distinguish between pure awareness and just the brain's capacity for self-reflection? Lyralei smiled with the patience of someone who had spent centuries contemplating exactly these questions. Through direct investigation. Right now, in this moment, you are aware of my words. You are aware of the fire burning in front of us. You are aware of your own thoughts and reactions to what I'm saying. What is it that is aware of all these things? Well,
I am, Harrison replied uncertainly.
Yes, but what is this I that you speak of? Is it your body? Your body is one of the things you're aware of, so it can't be that which is aware. Is it your thoughts?
Your thoughts are things you observe coming and going, so you can't be identical with them.
Is it your emotions?
Again, emotions are experiences you have, not what you essentially are.
Harrison looked puzzled. I'm not sure I understand what you're getting at.
Look directly at the awareness that is perceiving all these various experiences, Lyralei suggested.
Don't think about it, just notice it directly. Can you find any boundaries to this awareness? Can you locate where it begins or ends? Can you find any qualities that define or limit it?
Harrison sat quietly for several minutes, clearly engaged in some kind of inner investigation. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of wonder.
I can't find any edges to it. It seems to be everywhere. And it doesn't seem to have any particular characteristics. It's just aware.
Exactly, Lyralei confirmed. This borderless, qualityless awareness is what you truly are.
Not your personality, not your history, not your beliefs or opinions or preferences, just this pure capacity to be aware.
And this awareness is not produced by your brain or limited to your body. It is the very consciousness within which your entire experience of being a separate individual arises.
Marcus had been listening to this exchange with deep appreciation for Lyralei's skill as a teacher.
She had a remarkable ability to guide people toward direct recognition of their own true nature without imposing beliefs or concepts that they weren't ready to accept. What Lyralei is describing, he added, is not a philosophy or a belief system. It's something that anyone can verify through their own direct investigation. You don't need to take anyone's word for it, you can look for yourself and see what you find. Dr. Mitchell had been largely silent during these evening sessions, but Marcus could see that she was wrestling with ideas that challenged everything she had been trained to believe about consciousness and human nature.
Finally, she spoke up.
Even if what you're saying is true, even if consciousness is somehow more fundamental than we assume, I don't see how that relates to the claims you've made about transcending physical limitations or achieving immortality. The connection, Lyralei explained, is that once you recognize yourself as consciousness itself rather than as a temporary physical form, death becomes literally impossible.
How can consciousness die? How can awareness cease to exist?
What you call death is simply consciousness withdrawing its attention from one particular set of experiences and focusing on others.
But what about the brain? Sarah asked.
We know that consciousness can be altered by brain injuries, affected by drugs, diminished by disease.
Doesn't this prove that consciousness is dependent on physical processes?
What it proves, Marcus replied, is that consciousness uses the brain as an interface for operating in physical reality. When you alter the interface, you alter the way consciousness expresses itself through that particular system. But the consciousness itself remains unchanged, just as a television program remains unchanged whether you watch it on a small screen or a large one, in color or black and white.
Lyralei nodded. The Kadarians understood this relationship very clearly.
They developed what you might call technologies of consciousness, methods for accessing and directing awareness that didn't depend on physical instruments. What they discovered is that consciousness, when properly focused and directed, can organize matter and energy in ways that seem impossible from a purely materialist perspective. Over the following weeks, Lyralei began to demonstrate some of these technologies of consciousness to the small group of researchers who showed genuine interest in learning. She taught them meditation techniques that could quickly and reliably induce states of expanded awareness. She showed them how to perceive the energy fields that surrounded all living beings. Most remarkably, she began to demonstrate what could only be described as psychokinetic abilities, the capacity to influence physical matter through the direct application of focused intention. These abilities, she explained, are not supernatural or mystical. They are natural capacities of consciousness that become available when awareness is no longer limited by the belief that it exists only within the boundaries of a physical body. every human being possesses these potentials, but most people never develop them because they are too identified with their weak selves to access their true power. Dr. Reeves proved to be particularly adept at learning these techniques. Within a few days of beginning the consciousness training, she was able to reliably perceive auras and energy fields around plants, animals, and other people. More significantly, she began to demonstrate what seemed like telepathic sensitivity, accurately reading the thoughts and emotions of others even when they made no external display of their inner states. "It's not that I'm reading minds," she explained to her fascinated colleagues. "It's more like, when my awareness expands beyond the boundaries of my personal self, I can directly perceive what's happening in the awareness of others. We're not actually separate beings who occasionally manage to communicate across the gaps between us. We're all expressions of one underlying consciousness that only appears to be divided into separate individuals." These demonstrations had a profound effect on the small group of researchers who witnessed them. Even Dr. Harrison, who had initially been the most skeptical about consciousness-related claims, began to accept that human potential might be far greater than conventional science acknowledged. "I still don't understand how any of this is possible," he admitted, "but I can't deny what I'm seeing with my own eyes. If consciousness really can transcend normal physical limitations, then we need to completely revise our understanding of what human beings are capable of." Lyralii used his growing openness as a teaching opportunity. "The limitation is not in consciousness itself, but in consciousness's identification with limitation. When you believe yourself to be nothing more than a physical body with a temporary lifespan, you automatically accept the constraints that seem to apply to physical bodies. But when you recognize yourself as consciousness itself, you discover that you are not actually subject to those constraints at all." But how does someone make that shift from identifying with the body to identifying with consciousness? Sarah asked. Despite her continued skepticism about some of the more dramatic claims, she had found herself increasingly fascinated by the philosophical implications of these ideas. "Through the systematic destruction of the weak self," Marcus replied. "Through carefully examining every belief, every assumption, every aspect of identity that is based on limitation, and releasing attachment to anything that is not genuinely unlimited and eternal." Lyralii elaborated on this process. "The weak self is constructed entirely of identifications with things that are temporary and limited. It says, I am my thoughts, I am my emotions, I am my personal history, I am my physical appearance, I am my social role, I am my nationality, I am my beliefs. But all of these things are subject to change and loss. When you derive your sense of identity from anything that can be taken away, you inevitably experience fear and insecurity. The true self, by contrast, identifies only with that which is permanent and unlimited. It says, I am awareness itself, I am consciousness itself, I am that which was never born and can never die. When your sense of identity is based on something that truly cannot be threatened or destroyed, fear becomes impossible, and, with the disappearance of fear comes the awakening of extraordinary power." Dr. Mitchell found herself asking, "But isn't it dangerous to encourage people to think they're unlimited or immortal? Doesn't that lead to recklessness or grandiosity?" "Only if the understanding remains intellectual rather than genuine," Lyralii explained. "True recognition of one's unlimited nature leads not to recklessness but to profound responsibility, not to grandiosity but to humility. When you recognize that you are consciousness itself, you also recognize that everyone and everything else is consciousness itself. You cannot harm others without harming yourself, and you cannot help others without helping yourself." Marcus added, "The weak self is actually what leads to recklessness and grandiosity, because it's always trying to prove its worth or defend its image. The true self has nothing to prove and nothing to defend. It acts from love and wisdom rather than from fear and ego." As the weeks passed, more people began to arrive at the archaeological site. Word of the remarkable discoveries and demonstrations had begun to spread through informal networks, attracting individuals from around the world who were interested in consciousness research, ancient civilizations, or human potential development. Lyralii welcomed all sincere seekers, regardless of their background or level of understanding. "The teaching is not meant for a special few," she explained to the growing gathering. "Every human being has the same potential for awakening to their true nature. The only requirements are genuine interest in truth and willingness to question assumptions about reality that may no longer serve. One evening, a young physicist named David Chen, no relation to Marcus, arrived at the site after traveling from Beijing specifically to investigate reports of consciousness-related phenomena that seemed to violate known laws of physics. He was immediately struck by the atmosphere of the place, which seemed to vibrate with an almost tangible energy of heightened awareness. "I've studied consciousness from a neuroscientific perspective for years," he told Lyralii during his first evening at the site, "but I've never encountered anything like what I'm observing here. People are demonstrating abilities that shouldn't be possible according to everything we know about how the brain works." Lyralii smiled at his combination of fascination and bewilderment. "What you call the brain is an exquisite instrument that consciousness uses to operate in physical reality," she explained, "but consciousness itself is not limited to or produced by physical processes. When consciousness recognizes its own unlimited nature, it becomes capable of expressing itself in ways that transcend normal biological constraints." David looked around at the small group of people who were engaged in various forms of consciousness practice, some sitting in meditation, others practicing energy perception exercises, still others engaged in telepathic communication experiments. But how is any of this possible? How can consciousness exist independently of neural activity? The question assumes that consciousness is somehow separate from the physical world, Lyralii replied. But what if consciousness is the fundamental reality from which the physical world emerges? What if what you call matter is simply consciousness that has temporarily forgotten its own nature? David shook his head in confusion. That sounds like idealism or mysticism, not science. We know that consciousness emerges from complex interactions among neurons. We can observe how changes in brain chemistry affect mental states. How can you claim that consciousness is more fundamental than the physical processes that produce it? Marcus joined the conversation. Consider this possibility, David. What if the relationship between consciousness and brain activity is more like the relationship between a television program and a television set? The program uses the TV to manifest in visible form, but the program itself is not created by the television. Damage the TV, and you alter how the program appears, but the program itself remains unchanged. But that analogy breaks down, David objected, because we know that television programs are transmitted through electromagnetic signals that exist independently of the receiving apparatus. There's no equivalent signal that could be transmitting consciousness to brains. Lyralii considered his objection carefully. You're correct that the analogy is imperfect. But consider another possibility. What if consciousness is not transmitted to brains but is rather the field within which brains and all other phenomena arise? What if individual awareness is not produced by neural activity but is rather one way that universal consciousness focuses itself into apparently separate points of attention? David was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with ideas that challenged his most basic assumptions about reality. Even if that were true, he said finally, how could we ever verify it scientifically? How could we test claims about universal consciousness or transcendent awareness? Through the same method that consciousness uses to verify anything else, Marcus replied. Through direct investigation. Right now, you are aware of our conversation, aware of your own thoughts and reactions, aware of the environment around us. What is it that is aware of all these things? David started to answer, then stopped himself. He spent several minutes in quiet contemplation before speaking again. I can't locate the awareness itself, he said with obvious surprise. I can observe thoughts, sensations, perceptions, but I can't find the observer. It seems to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Exactly, Lyralii confirmed. This invisible, unlimited awareness is what you truly are. Not your thoughts about yourself, not your memories or beliefs or personal history, just this pure capacity to be aware. And this awareness is not confined to the boundaries of your physical body any more than space is confined to the boundaries of the objects that appear within it. Over the following days, David threw himself into the consciousness practices with the focused intensity that had made him successful in physics research. He quickly began to experience states of expanded awareness that seemed to confirm what Lyralii and Marcus were teaching about the unlimited nature of consciousness. This is extraordinary, he told them after a particularly profound meditation session.
I feel like I've been living inside a tiny box my entire life and have suddenly discovered that there are no walls. The sense of being a separate individual seems completely arbitrary now, just one way that consciousness can focus its attention, but not the only way. You're beginning to understand, Lyrelii said with evident pleasure. The experience of being a separate self is not wrong or illusory, but it is only one possibility among infinite others. When consciousness recognizes its own unlimited nature, it becomes capable of expressing itself in forms and ways that seemed impossible from the perspective of limited identification. As David's understanding deepened, he began to develop the same kinds of psychic abilities that Dr. Reeves and some of the other students had manifested. More importantly, he began to understand how these abilities were possible from a scientific perspective. "I think I'm beginning to see how this works," he explained to the group one evening. "If consciousness is indeed the fundamental field within which all phenomena arise, then focused intention could theoretically influence the probability patterns that determine how quantum events manifest into physical reality. What we call psychic abilities might just be consciousness learning to operate directly at the quantum level rather than being limited to the gross physical interfaces of sensory organs and motor neurons." Lyrelii nodded approvingly. The Kadarians understood these principles very clearly, though they expressed them in different terms. They discovered that consciousness, when properly focused and directed, could influence what you call quantum probability fields to organize matter and energy in ways that serve conscious intention. This is how they were able to achieve technological capabilities that seemed impossible to civilizations that attempted to work only with physical tools and processes. The growing group of consciousness researchers began to attract attention from academic institutions, government agencies, and private research organizations around the world. Some of this attention was hostile. There were attempts to discredit the research, to explain away the phenomena as fraud or delusion, and to prevent information about the discoveries from reaching mainstream media. But there was also genuine interest from serious researchers who recognized that something extraordinary was happening at the site. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a neuroscientist from the University of Barcelona, arrived with sophisticated brain monitoring equipment hoping to document the neural correlates of the consciousness states that were being reported. "I want to understand what's happening in the brains of people who claim to be experiencing expanded awareness," she explained to Lyrelii. "If these states are real, they should produce measurable changes in neural activity that we can study and, potentially, replicate." Lyrelii was happy to accommodate her research, though she suspected that Dr. Vasquez was asking the wrong questions. The EEG and brain imaging equipment revealed remarkable patterns of neural activity in people who had learned to access expanded states of consciousness, but the patterns seemed to suggest that the brain was functioning more like a receiver than a generator of conscious experience. "Look at this," Dr. Vasquez said after analyzing several days' worth of data. "During states of reported expanded awareness, overall brain activity actually decreases rather than increases. It's as if the brain is getting out of the way rather than working harder to produce these experiences." Marcus found this result completely consistent with what he understood about consciousness and brain function. What if the brain's primary job is not to create consciousness but to filter and focus it? What if expanded awareness represents the brain learning to interfere less with consciousness rather than working harder to enhance it? Dr. Vasquez looked puzzled. "But that would imply that consciousness exists independently of neural activity, which contradicts everything we know about how the brain works." "Does it?" Lyrelii asked gently. "Or does it simply suggest that our current understanding of how the brain works may be incomplete? Consider the possibility that neural activity is consciousness organizing itself into patterns that can interface with physical reality, rather than physical processes somehow generating consciousness." As the research continued, more evidence accumulated that consciousness could indeed transcend normal physical limitations when it was no longer constrained by limiting beliefs about its own nature. People were demonstrating abilities that seemed impossible according to conventional neuroscience: accurate telepathic communication, remote perception of distant events, direct influence on physical systems through focused intention, and access to information that had no normal sensory basis. Most remarkably, several individuals who had undergone the process of systematic self-inquiry that Marcus and Lyrelii taught began to exhibit what could only be described as healing abilities.
They were able to accelerate the recovery of people with injuries or illnesses simply by focusing their attention on the affected areas with clear intention for restoration and healing. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who had initially been the most skeptical about consciousness-related claims, found herself profoundly affected when she witnessed one of these healing demonstrations. A local villager had arrived at the site with a severely infected wound that conventional medicine had been unable to treat effectively. David Chen, who had become remarkably adept at focused intention practices, spent 30 minutes directing his attention to the infected area with clear intention for healing and restoration. Within hours, the infection began to clear, and, within days, the wound had healed completely with no scarring or other complications. Medical examination revealed that the healing had occurred far more rapidly and completely than should have been possible under normal circumstances. "I don't know how to explain what I've just witnessed," Dr. Mitchell told Lyralii later that day. "Every assumption I've held about the relationship between mind and matter, between consciousness and physical reality, has been challenged by what I've seen here. How is it possible for focused intention to produce such dramatic physical effects?" Lyralii responded with infinite compassion for the difficulty of accepting such a radical expansion of worldview. "What you call physical reality is not separate from consciousness, it is consciousness expressing itself in particular forms and patterns. When consciousness recognizes its own creative nature and learns to focus itself with clear intention, it becomes capable of reorganizing these patterns in ways that serve healing, growth, and evolution." "But that implies that consciousness is somehow magical," Sarah said. "It suggests that reality operates according to principles that are completely different from what science has discovered." "Not different," Marcus corrected, "but more complete. What science has discovered about the behavior of matter and energy remains valid within its appropriate scope. But these discoveries represent only one level of how reality operates. Consciousness represents a deeper level of causation that can influence and organize the patterns that science observes at the physical level." As word of the healing demonstration spread, people began arriving at the site seeking help for various ailments and conditions. Lyralii established clear guidelines for this work, emphasizing that the healing was not something that she or the other practitioners did to people, but rather something that consciousness did for itself when it was no longer limited by beliefs about what was possible. "True healing," she explained to each person who came seeking help, "occurs when consciousness recognizes that it is not actually limited by the conditions it appears to be experiencing. Physical symptoms are real and deserve compassionate attention, but they are not the whole truth about what you are. When you remember your true nature as unlimited awareness, your body naturally reorganizes itself to reflect this understanding." The work attracted attention from medical researchers who were interested in studying the mechanisms behind consciousness-based healing. Dr. Maria Santos, an oncologist from Sao Paulo, arrived with a team of medical specialists hoping to document cases where people with serious illnesses experienced improvement through consciousness work. "I've seen too many cases of spontaneous remission to dismiss the possibility that consciousness might play a role in healing," she told Lyralii. "But I need to understand how this process works if I'm going to integrate it into responsible medical practice." Lyralii welcomed the medical research, understanding that rigorous documentation would be essential for gaining broader acceptance of consciousness-based healing approaches. Over the following months, Dr. Santos and her team documented numerous cases of accelerated healing, symptom reduction, and, in some cases, complete recovery from conditions that had been considered medically hopeless. "What we're observing defies conventional medical understanding," Dr. Santos reported after 6 months of research. "People are recovering from diseases that should be incurable, healing from injuries far more rapidly than normal physiology allows, and experiencing improvements that seem to have no basis in any known medical mechanism." The key factor that seemed to correlate with healing outcomes was not the specific technique used, but rather the degree to which the individual had successfully released their identification with limitation and recognized their true nature as unlimited consciousness. Those who had undergone the most complete transformation of self-understanding experienced the most dramatic healing results. "Healing is not something that consciousness does," Lyralii explained to Dr. Santos. "Healing is what consciousness is. When awareness is no longer constrained by beliefs about limitation, disease, and death, the body naturally returns to its optimal state of health and vitality." What you call miraculous healing is simply consciousness remembering its own unlimited nature. As the first year of teaching drew to a close, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred not just in his own life but in the lives of everyone who had seriously engaged with the consciousness work that Lyralii offered. People were discovering abilities they had never imagined they possessed, experiencing states of awareness that transcended anything they had thought possible, and developing an unshakable sense of their own unlimited nature. Most importantly, they were learning to embody the teaching in their daily lives. The expanded awareness and enhanced abilities were not ends in themselves but natural expressions of consciousness that had learned to operate from its true nature rather than from limitation and fear. The goal is not to develop psychic powers or achieve immortality, Lyralii explained during one of her final formal teaching sessions of the year. The goal is simply to remember what you have always been: unlimited consciousness expressing itself in temporary form for the sheer joy of experiencing its own infinite creativity. When you live from this understanding, everything becomes possible not because you have gained something new, but because you have stopped limiting yourself with beliefs about what you cannot do. You discover that you are already everything you ever dreamed of becoming. You realize that you are already home in the very awareness that you have never actually left. As Marcus listened to these words, he felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought him to this understanding. The weak self that had once struggled with doubt, limitation, and fear seemed like a distant memory now. What remained was the indestructible core of pure awareness that could never be threatened by any external circumstance because it was the very source from which all circumstances arose. He had learned that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has discovered the part of himself that was never born and can never die. And, in discovering this truth, he had awakened something that had been sleeping in stone for a millennium, bringing back to the world an understanding of human potential that had been waiting patiently for consciousness to remember what it truly is. The teaching would continue, spreading from person to person as each individual who remembered their true nature naturally inspired that same remembrance in others. What had begun with a kiss had become a worldwide awakening to the unlimited possibilities that exist when consciousness learns to operate from love rather than fear, from truth rather than limitation, from its own indestructible essence rather than the weak self's dreams of smallness and separation. The statue was no longer dead, and neither was the understanding it had preserved. Consciousness had remembered itself once again, and the world would never be the same.